Okay, this afternoon what we're going to talk about is the laboratory work on the out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. And we're going to talk a little bit about the explanations that people put forth for these experiences. One of the most important questions, and Carlos talked about this morning, and you can put the first transparency on, is what does the out-of-body experience really signify? Does it mean that there's something that's exteriorizing itself from the body, something that actually goes out during the experience? Or is it a hallucination, a vivid imagery experience, something like a dream, something that's totally imaginal? And that's a question that you can sort of get at when you look at the case collections, but you can't really get at it directly. And I think that was one of the reasons why people wanted to try and take a look at, come up with ideas of things that they could do in the laboratory that would help them decide whether or not something goes out or it's an imaginal experience. In the literature, Kardec is a spiritualist, so that's or a spiritist. In the spiritist literature, in the works of Krukl, who was an experiencer, there's this notion of subtle bodies, and certainly in the old astral projection literature, there's a lot of information about subtle bodies, and there's systems that talk about one body that goes out, and then systems that talk about several different bodies, and they have different purposes. And then, of course, in the psychological literature on out-of-body experience, people are taking a look at the similarities between the experience and hallucinations and imagery. So those are questions that people are interested in, and one of the ways that was thought of in the 60s and up through the decade since was, how can we get at this in the laboratory? How can we look at this in the laboratory? Can we have the second slide? In 1968, Charles Tart, who was a faculty member at University of California at Davis and is very well known in psychology and parapsychology, he's the altered states guy. He had a student who claimed to be able to have out-of-body experiences at will. And Charlie thought, well, this is a good opportunity to try and figure out what we could do experimentally to show that this person is actually going out of their body to get the information during their out-of-body experience. So they set up two rooms in a laboratory at UC Davis. In one room, it was set up as a sleep lab with a bed, with a thing in the electrical box in the wall, connecting the sleeping room with the observation room, so that his student, Ms. Z, could lie down on the bed and be hooked up to the EEG monitors, and he could run EEG monitoring all night long. There was an observation window so he could monitor her progress, and then he came up with the idea of coming up with a numerical target that he would put on a shelf in the room high up. She wouldn't know what the identity of the target was, and the idea was that as she had her OBE and she had her OBEs during sleep, she would try and get up there and read the face of the target. So they set up 4 experimental sessions over an 8-week period, and that was the task. There was an individual target. She was supposed to try and have an out-of-body experience, get up there and read the target. And then when she woke in the morning, before anybody came into the room, she would say, I had an out-of-body, I saw these numbers, or whatever, or I didn't have an experience. The first 3 nights that they had in the experimental session, she didn't have an out-of-body experience. On the 4th night she did, and she was able to report the target number exactly. And her experience was that she had had this out-of-body experience and gone up there, floated up and seen the numbers. He was monitoring her during this experiment and looking at her EEGs, and there were some anomalies, he said, in the EEG readings for that particular evening. But later on they discovered that in a darkened room, if you took a flashlight and shone it up against the clock face, which was above the target box, you could actually see a reflection of the numbers. So they were not, he had kind of a qualified result there. It was very interesting to him, but because of this problem with the experimental design, he couldn't be as strong about the conclusion as he would like to be. Unfortunately, Ms. Z wasn't interested in doing any more experiments, and Charlie was unable to find another subject, another student another person among his student population who claimed to be an at-will, out-of-body experiencer. So this type of experiment, at least in Charlie's laboratory, was not repeated. There are other ways to test to test these things. Keith Harari, who you'll hear about a little bit later, and Jerry Solfan, who's a clinical psychologist and a parapsychologist, did a study in which they had out-of-body experiencers and non-out-of-body experiencers, and they were supposed to identify tape-recorded sounds played at a distance and whether or not a person was present in the distant location where the sounds were being played. And the idea was, can the out-of-body experiencers go to that location and get this information more reliably or more accurately than the non-out-of-body experiencers? One of them was able to produce significant results, but then the question becomes, are they really getting this information because they have left the body and proceeded to that location, or is this a form of ESP that in these people who are, as we all know now, more likely to have lots of psychic experiences, just better at doing ESP? So it didn't really answer this exteriorization problem. So another question came, if you give me the next transparency. And this was dependent on, this came out of Keith Harari, part of Keith Harari's interaction with the Psychical Research Foundation, which was in Durham, North Carolina. This is actually Professor Robert Morris, who's going to be giving a talk for us for part of the Perspectives series. In the 1970s, he was a staff member of this particular research organization in Durham, North Carolina, and they were very much interested in this whole out-of-body experience question. I think Jerry Sullivan was on the staff there at that time, so it was an interest that he brought with him. And Keith Harari, who was a psychologist and a parapsychologist, was known to be an at-will out-of-body experiencer. So initially they started to try and think about, okay, we need to figure out a way to detect if something actually leaves the body and goes to where the target is. And some of the first things that they did were to set up heat detectors and light detectors and all kinds of things that would measure ambient environment type variables. And one of the experimenters who was monitoring closely in the same room with the detection equipment had a couple of anomalous experiences during the times when Keith Harari claimed to be proceeding in an out-of-body state to that room and trying to affect the detection grid. And that person felt that they saw something or they felt something, and they thought that they personally could detect when Keith was in that room. So then they set up a set of experiments in which they were using individuals from the laboratory as detectors, and they just weren't very reliable. They had these anomalous experiences, but they weren't having them at a regular rate, and so they weren't able to really get any information about whether or not Keith was able to exteriorize himself to the target location. Well, Bob Morris was trained at Duke University as a comparative psychologist. He did his PhD thesis on ring doves and the behavior of ring doves. So he's always a guy who was very comfortable around animal experiments, and particularly behavioral ones, not the dissecting kind. And he thought, well, why don't we set up some kind of a grid in which that we can use to measure the movement of an animal, and we'll bring animals into a cage or the grid area or whatever, and we'll have Keith go at certain times to try and affect this animal, and maybe the animal will quiet when he's there, maybe the animal will show some kind of indication that Keith is there. In one experiment that they did that Scott Rogel reports in a book that he wrote on the near-death experience, they were using gerbils, and the gerbils basically could care less. Nothing ever happened. They didn't change their behavior at all. Experimental or control sessions didn't matter. Then they tried a snake, and when Scott Rogel was the monitor in the room with the animal, he recorded he talks about one incident in which they had the snake all coiled up, and he had said to Professor Morris, well, how the heck am I supposed to know if this snake is reacting to something? And Bob apparently said to him, well, his respiration rate will increase. It was, well, do snakes breathe, and can you see snakes breathing? Well, you know, his heart will beat faster. Well, where's his heart? And where should I look? And he said, well, just watch him and let us know, if something unusual happens. Well, the snake was basically quiet during most of the experimental and control sessions, and then in one session, the snake had been curled up in a corner of the aquarium they had him in, and he just got agitated and dove under the sawdust at the bottom, and then brought himself back up and started to bite at the side of the cage. And Scott was a little frightened by this and later discovered that this was during an experimental session in which Keith was reporting that he had gone to the aquarium and was trying to knock on the aquarium in his out-of-body state. Unfortunately, the snake was not a consistent detector of Keith. So one of the ideas they had was to use the kittens that Keith had, who are named Spirit and Soul, who Carlos took care of at one point. And the idea in this experiment was to set up this grid with the numbers, and you put the cat in there. The cats were both very young and liked to run around a lot, liked to do a lot of meowing. And they were very close to Keith, and they tended to kind of get very quiet around him and very affectionate and so on. So the idea was, let's see if during the experimental sessions when Keith is supposed to be in the room, do we see some kind of significant difference in the behavior of these kittens when Keith is there. And in one set of the sessions, they did find a difference that made them very excited about the experiment, in the sense that one of the cats, and now I don't remember if it was Spirit or Soul, Spirit, just got absolutely quiescent and was lying around and not meowing and looked like somebody was there visiting them. So they got very excited about that. But in the replication experiment, because you can't ever rely on just one experiment, they didn't find the same kinds of significant results. And unfortunately, as the cats got older, they responded less and less to Keith, probably in the body as well as out of the body. So this was a detection study that was a great idea, but didn't actually, was never replicated and didn't have the kind of results that people were hoping for it to have. What we're going to do now is I want to show you, and I'm not sure how this is going to be with we can turn this off, with the overhead, a tape that we were given by the Alex Tanis Foundation, and the experiment that it shows you is a detection experiment for out-of-body that was done at the American Society for Psychical Research across the way here. Carlos Osis was the main researcher over there at the time, and he was also very interested in this idea of how do you test exteriorization. And he did a number of studies. We're going to talk about his work with Ingo Swann as well. But this one is a tape that will show you actually a session getting set up with Alex Tanis, who is a psychic, as they're getting ready to go into the experiment and how the experiment worked, and this very clever idea that Dr. Osis had about how you could figure out whether or not there was somebody actually there at the target, or if they were getting the information from ESP.
Here at the American Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1884, an out-of-body experiment was set up for us. The subject, Alex Tanis, a 56-year-old man who claims to have been having out-of-body experiences since he was a child. He's been participating in these experiments since 1968. Alex, how would you describe an out-of-body experience?
An out-of-body experience for me, a separation of my consciousness from my body, which is able to perceive on its own. In other words, it's able to see my body down here, where I'm lying now, or that my consciousness will go to Peru, will go anywhere in the world and perceive what is there and bring back the information. And therefore, it is a separation of the consciousness. That would be the simplest explanation I could give you.
Well, what happens in the brain when the mind or the consciousness appears to be projected elsewhere?
We have found that there are changes in the brain. I seem to go into an altered state of consciousness. Not seem, I do go into an altered state of consciousness. Therefore, there is a change in the brain when it happens, and it's a marvelous experience for me. Whatever is registered, there's a state that I go into, which is a oneness with the universe, and they're able to pick that up on the EEG. And it's a state of consciousness where there is complete harmony, and I love it. I always say I don't want to come back.
How do you see, Alex, when you're out of body?
When I'm out of body, in the very beginning, I have to say that it was a light projection. By light projection, I mean I was a ball of light. Now I have a physical, a double, just like me. And what happens from this booth, this isolated booth, to where the experiment takes place, I observe him, which is created, a physical, and he does all the things I want done. In other words, he is there in a flash.
In other words, the experiment we're going to see, during that experiment, your body will remain in this isolation box.
That's right.
But your mind will be about 5 rooms from here.
Yes, but even more, I call it the Alex 2. He is actually physically there, and I see him from here.
You do?
Yes.
But no one else in that room will
No
see.
one else. This is the next step in their experiment, where they're going to show that it can be done through a special camera, which we hope to put together.
Is the mind so powerful that it can survive at the moment of death?
To me, yes. It's so powerful because it needs, in itself, it needs to survive. That's the way I feel, as much as it needs to think, as much as we need to learn. And to me, I think we're just going back to the fulfillment of what mankind was at the very beginning. So not something that we've lost, but something, a transition that we've been going through and returning to immortality.
Alex, there are many viewers, I'm sure, who are very skeptical, many who would say this is a lot of malarkey. I mean, how do you get anyone to understand that what you're saying is not fantasy, but reality?
Well, there are two things here. My near-death experiences, I think anyone who had gone through one will share the experience, and that you can't give to anybody. I wish I could. But I think the work that we're doing here under the scientific eye, and that we're able to relate or correlate what happens in at least in the beginning of the near-death experience, that there is a separation, I think that people will see much more actual and much more factual until they have their own experience. But I think the work that was being done and the work that's being reported by medical doctors, because there's so many new books out now where people have said that they have separated themselves and had seen themselves on the operating table or trying to be revived and so forth. So I think that now that other disciplines like physics, medicine, psychology, all of them are agreeing that it's no longer a fantasy, that a real experience takes place and that we have to. And to me, it is a religious experience. Perhaps more than a religious, I think a spiritual experience, because none of my religious training took me into this dimension. No, it was brimstone and fire and, you're going to burn in hell. But there's nothing of that. It's a joyful experience. It's so beautiful that we should wait for it with great joy.
You claim that after 10 years of experimentation, you have absolutely determined that there are out-of-body experiences. What can be done with this knowledge?
Well, the first knowledge, I think, we are sharing our knowledge with other disciplines so that they can know where to go from there in the medical work, the physics and so forth. I think that's one of the great things when other disciplines can join us. And secondly, it's giving spirituality and religion and philosophy a new dimension also, a new thought of what has gone, especially coming from the laboratory work. And thirdly, I think that that what different people are using this, like helping the police solve murder cases, lost people, find lost cities, archaeological work, and even people who are like myself with diagnosed cases, and even more. Something I've very rarely spoken about, where I have touched people who had cancer, like pituitary gland, and it disappeared. So the energy is there, and it's a physical energy but it's a spiritual energy.
How do you explain all of this?
I explain it, well, to some people it would be very hard. That I would say I'm in the heart of God. And we all are, and we haven't seen it. I'm not saying fully, but I've touched something, or someone has touched me, and somebody loves me. Let's say that if we can look at this power like electricity, which we don't know what it is, and if we can harness it like electricity, then look at everything that electricity has done. We will do that 1,000,000 times more, because the power that we have is stronger than any power there is.
By harnessing the power of our own minds.
That's right.
What do you project can be done in the future?
In the future, I believe that mankind will become immortal.
How?
By letting this energy take over the matter and transforming it.
In other words, long after death, our minds will survive.
And while we are alive, I believe we're going to come to that point where we won't have to die. That our mind will take over the body and heal it forever. In other words, the mind will heal the body and mankind will not have to die. Because our greatest crutch and our greatest fear is maybe there's nothing on the other side. We don't know. No matter how many test tubes we try and how many experiments, we don't have the proof. What we're touching here is a direction, but not the whole universe will believe it.
Alex, tell us briefly, what are we about to see in this experiment?
In this experiment, I will be projecting my consciousness, Alex 2, 50 feet away, into a strain gauge box which will measure my physical presence. At the same time, I will be reading targets that they will select randomly by push button, which I will be reading to show that I'm actually there. In these two facets, it will show you how I leave my body and what can be done with it. And therefore, it will be registered on the EEG as we go along.
When Alex 2 is projected 50 feet from here, what is Alex 1 doing in this chamber?
Alex 1 is observing what is taking place and reading what's going on. He will describe what's taking place in the 50 feet away. I actually see the other room, and it's all open to me from here.
Now, have you seen any of the equipment that's in there, or what's going to be projected before?
No, I have not. I know the experiment itself. I know that there's a wheel with 4 colors on it. They will project a series of pictures on there. I know what the pictures are. In other words, by saying that I know what the pictures are, there are 5 pictures that they will randomly show on that. But by pressing a button, everything interlocks, so I don't know what interlocks, and that's what is the importance, what interlocks in there.
Go on.
While I was in Russia several years ago, we were discussing parapsychology, and I was doing a special test over there. And one of the men that was working at the university said, "Do you know, Alex?" He said, the one who finds the secret to the mind will rule the world." And I understood that meant that it was more powerful than the atom bomb or anything else would create, because the mind would be able to do anything anywhere in the world, in the universe.
Monitoring the test, Dr. Carlos Osis, a 30-year veteran of parapsychology research, and Donna McCormick, who's been with the Society for 7 years.
Where are you now?
Well, we've already made it. You might see it on the EEG.
Something happened.
Something happened, huh?
Do you feel Alex 2 is still in the box?
Yes.
Now jump out of it.
There we go. I just jumped over. Something must have happened right now. I just jumped over the swing.
Do you see the lights there?
Yes, I do. Upper right hand. Red elephant.
Dial number 4.
Upper right hand. Black man.
Fine. We are at number 10 now.
Lower left hand. Blue man.
We get indications that Alex is able to see these pictures. If you can locate yourself right in front of the viewing window, you will see from that small area. And he got it well. He got about twice what you would expect by coincidence. The brainwaves are different, and he says he's out. And then we have the physical indications. Something moves there. The main thing what we want to find out of it, is it simply clairvoyant, hitting the things in my machine, or is it really out there? Now, if it's out there, we had to create an image what is visible only from very narrow place, and not from the surface inside the box.
First of all, Doctor, how did Alex do in this experiment?
We haven't checked all, but he did very well on that aspect, color, which indicates that he really has been out there in front of the apparatus, his mind.
how do you know that he had what you call an out-of-body experience rather than some clairvoyant experience?
This is why we built the equipment that way. Now, what is it? First, there's a larger box. In the back of it is a colored wheel with 4 quadrants, which locks in 1 of 4 positions according to the random number generator. Nobody knows where it is a lot at the time. Projected on it, on the quadrants and the colors, looks like to be a line drawing. Could be an elephant, a disc, could be hand or whatnot.
The point that he's trying to make here is that they set up the target display in such a way that if you're in the front of it, you see the target in one way. If you were looking down on the target or seeing the target in the way that the experimenter put it together, you would see it totally different. The colors would be in a different position and you wouldn't see the little thing that gets projected out of the box. So in that way they were hoping, we can have the Ingo Swan one, in that way they were hoping to be able to see whether or not there was an orientation to Alex's perception. If he got it exactly the way that you could only see it from the front of the box, and the strain gauges that were on either side of the viewing window indicated that something was there was some kind of vibration or some kind of change in the strain gauges there, then they would have more evidence that something had gone out of Alex's body and looked through the viewing window to see the target and affected the strain gauges while he was doing it. If, on the other hand, he got the picture of the target that would have been apparent from the top down inside the sealed box, then possibly that would be ESP, or if he got parts of it or in different positions. So they were trying to separate out this exteriorization idea that Alex had gone there from the idea of maybe he was picking up the information from ESP. This is another experiment in the same series in which they were using Ingo Swan, and again they had these different types of targets that had different orientations depending on which part of the box, which part of the target was in front of the viewing window when the trial happened. And then Ingo would write down or draw what he had seen. Now Alex, the other thing to get from the tape is how strong Alex Tanis's personal feelings are about what he was doing, why he was doing it, and what he meant. And later on we're going to talk about the after effects of having these types of experiences and what they do to a person's philosophy. And so that's a really good indication of someone who's had a number of experiences and has developed a very strong, unshakable belief in how the world works because he's been there and he's experienced it in this particular way. As Carlos said, though, every OBEer is different and they all have different shades of understandings of what they've been through, and they attach different meanings to it. So that was another reason why we wanted you to see the beginning of that. So this was a series of detection studies that were done at the ASPR, and they were trying to just tease out this notion of what is it ESP when an OBEer comes back with correct information, or is it that they actually are going out and they're at that location. One thing that is unfortunate is that later on, when this experiment was looked at again, it became kind of apparent that the strain gauge work was not as evidential as people had thought to begin with, because the strain gauges were very sensitive and they reacted to other vibrations in the building, and the ASPR building has an elevator for the tenant's apartment that was not shut down during the experimental trials. So it's impossible at this point in time to go back to studies that were conducted in the 60s and the 70s and make sure that the strain gauge evidence wasn't related to other kinds of vibrations that were happening in the building. But it's a very unique and a very creative set of experiments, and the kind of research that Carlos Osis particularly was known for across his life. He had a huge, a very creative mind and a lot of interests. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the physiological tests that have been done of OBEers at the time of the OBE. Now Alex was making a number of claims about the EEG record that you could clearly see when a person is having an OBE. There have been a number of electrophysiological studies done. Charlie Tart did one with Robert Monroe, who was a very famous out-of-body experiencer and founded the Monroe Institute, which is in Virginia. And Tart found that when Monroe was claiming to have had an EEG, he had 7 to 8 hertz alpha waves and high amplitude theta waves in stage 1 sleep. His heart activity was okay. His rapid eye movement was not very pronounced. So he found this presence of alpha, presence of an identifiable stage of sleep, normal heart activity with Monroe. Gabbard and Twemlow, who have also done a lot of near-death experience work, also did experiments with Robert Monroe in the same year and with another subject, and they found that there was a difference in the amplitude in the EEG between the two hemispheres. They also found this low sort of hertz range and a different stage of sleep. Now, I'm not an electrophysiologist, but as you read through these studies, you can see that everybody was finding something different, basically, with the exception that they were finding a level of relaxation you would expect to find with an out-of-body state. Osis and Mitchell did a study with Ingo Swann, and he had diminished alpha wave activity. Morris and the psychical research team did it with Keith Harari, who was in the animal experiment, taking readings from relaxation periods and from OBE periods, and they found no significant difference between those two periods in a lot of these EEG measures, and also in measures of muscular tension and other kinds of things. John Palmer, who's at the Rhine Research Center in Durham now, he tried to induce out-of-body experiences in students who had never reported any out-of-body experiences in life, which is very brave, and took EEG readings as people went through this induction procedure and hoped to have their OBEs. 3 students who experienced strong OBEs showed more of this alpha wave activity, 30% more during that experimental period than they showed in the baseline. Stanley Krippner did a study in his laboratory, in his dream laboratory, and actually that was done very recently in 1996, a 4-night study with a person who occasionally has OBEs. And he did find that there was an interruption in his normal sleep pattern on the OBEs when he's on the nights that he claimed to have had an out-of-body experience. So on some nights he didn't have an experience, other nights he did, and on the nights that he did there was a disruption that was anomalous. It wasn't the kind of reading that they would expect if he was just sleeping. And there have been some other studies. The bottom line is that it's very difficult to tell just from these few studies, because we're talking about a period of from 1968 to 1996, so it's like 30 years almost. And it's maybe 6 or 8 studies. And each of the studies are related to each other in some way, in the sense that some of them are finding differences or finding presence of relaxation, but there's no kind of consistency, and there's not the level of experimentation that you would need to really be able to pin down whether or not there's some kind of characteristic brain state that's correlated with an out-of-body experience. And that's certainly a question that people are still interested in, and they're interested in also because of this question of exteriorization, or is it imagination. If you can find a brain state that's synonymous to one that you have in dreaming, if you find something really different, then you can say something about what is this experience really? Is it something that's very different? Now what we're going to do is we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to show you 2 sets of films that are not going to be on the video course when we sell it. So you'll get to see them. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop the tape, we're going to see these 2 tapes, and then when I come back I'll describe what it was that you were seeing before we go on. And that's for the benefit of the people who get the video course. The first one, we're going to be talking a lot about this guy in a little bit. This is a snippet from a television show which focused on near-death experiences, and the main researcher was Dr. Bruce Grayson, who's at the University of Virginia, used to be at the University of Connecticut. I think he spent most of his career on the near-death experience, excuse me, and he's going to be talking about the core phenomena that people have in their experiences, and there are 5 or 6 experiencers that will be talking about their individual the things that happen to them. We've got a group of very different people who had very similar experiences and talked about them in a fairly similar way, and clearly were impacted by them. And when we get to the core phenomena, you'll see that a lot of these individuals had the core phenomena that that Grayson and other people have talked about. Before we do that, I want to show you one more. Now, this is the one that speaks to the idea of having veridical information, of finding out something, seeing something that there's no way that you should have been able to know this. And this is probably one of the most famous cases of this kind of NDE. So now we've seen 2 snippets of movies that are here in the audiovisual library of the Foundation. So anytime you want to come and go through the catalog, you just make an appointment with the film librarian. We have tons of wonderful things.
What was the year of Carlos's film? Carlos's film? What was that year?
It would have been in the 70s, yeah, because they started the research program in '68, and I think they ran, like Alex said, all the way through 10 years, 12 years. So towards and then it was in that film that we saw, and they're showing the detection thing. Like a lot of experimentation in parapsychology, there was funding that became available to use to test survival-related hypotheses. That was what they did, and when the money ran out, there wasn't any money forthcoming from any other place, so that was the end of that line of research. But it was a very important line of research. In these 2 other films, Dr. Bruce Grayson, who spent his life working on the near-death experience and is now still working on it at University of Virginia, in the Division of Personality Studies, which is actually Dr. Ian Stevenson's unit that has made its reputation doing reincarnation research and near-death experience research, and it's where Carlos got his near-death experience interviewing experience was at the University of Virginia. So Dr. Grayson is there now, and that tape, I think, is like a lot of things that you'll see on popular television, in the sense that there are a lot of experiencers out there. We'll talk about the prevalence a little bit in a minute, but a lot of people who have these life-threatening experiences, whether they're actually something happens to them medically, or it's a situation where they believe that they're going to die, and the kind of thing that happens to them afterwards, this sort of contact with the afterlife, which is what they feel that it is, it's very similar from one person to the next. It's very similar from one culture to the next. Adults have similar experiences to children. You know, it's kind of hard to explain away the core set of phenomena that exists there. In the second videotape that we saw was a reenactment of the famous Maria case. This is probably one of the most famous OBE cases that contains this veridical element. Veridical is an old term, actually, from parapsychology. I always forget it's not in the popular parlance, and it just means that you've got stuff you can go and corroborate, and if it turns out to be true, it's veridical. They used to say falsidical too, and thank God they don't do that anymore. But it just means that there's an element there that you can use to say, yes, she really did have this perception. This particular NDE became the subject of a huge controversy. People were saying it couldn't possibly have happened that way. Well, when they wheeled her in on the gurney, she must have seen the doors go back and forth, and it's a reasonable thing to do, to take a look at the kinds of things that NDEers say in a hospital environment and say, could they have figured this out from sound? Could they have figured this out from movement in the surgical bay? Could they have figured this out from overheard conversation? Is it like something they saw on television? So in a sense, you want to ask those kinds of questions. But in this particular instance, the researcher didn't bother to go to the hospital and see where the roof was that the shoe had been. Didn't bother to really try and reenact the experience, and once that was done by the other side, the people who were responding to the controversy, it was clearly obvious that there was no way that that particular ledge was visible to anybody who was in a gurney coming in down below. So the case for us still stands, and in the skeptical community is still one that's criticized, and that's pretty usual. As Carlos was saying, it's not possible to do experiments with the near-death experience, but there is a lot of medical research that's been done, and Dr. Stevenson's lab and Dr. Grayson have done a lot of this, but also many other areas in many other hospitals in the United States and the UK. And one of the ideas that people have are to go to certain populations of patients and just ask everybody that's had a cardiac arrest or has died on the table, have you had this experience? And try to get a handle on who has the experiences, what was their medical condition, were they under anesthetic, what type of anesthetic, what are the features of the experience that they had. You can put up the next transparency. There's an awful lot of similarity from one near-death experience to the other. These are the core phenomena: this feeling of peace, the feeling of having separated from your body, entering a darkness, movement through a darkness is also reported, then seeing a light, sometimes at the end of the tunnel. Sometimes it's not a tunnel, sometimes it's a hallway, sometimes it's a river. I think one of Carlos's experience, who had an NDE after a very hard childbirth, had this experience of rushing, and it felt to her like she was rushing on a raft down a river. And then entering the light, seeing people at the other side of the light that you know, and people that you don't know. In one child's NDE, she saw several people who told her they were waiting around to get back to Earth. They were about to be reincarnated, and they just said hello. You know, so there's all kinds of folk. And then there's this conversation. There may be a panoramic rehash of your life experience, where you're reviewing how you lived your life. And then at some point, as you saw in the tape with the experiencers, the conversation turns around to, you have to go back. You either have to go back or you can choose to go back. In the child cases, Dr. Melvin Morse reports that frequently the children will say, well, the nice bright lady asked me if I would miss my mommy, and when I said yes, I came back. You know, so there's this point of choosing in some of these experiences. Or someone tells you if you go any farther from here, you can't go back. One of the oldest near-death experiences comes from Plato, and it's a fairly famous story about a soldier named who died in a battle with several of his friends and had this experience of going to the afterlife. When they get to the waters of Lethe, everybody drinks from them but him, and finally he's sent back to life because he hasn't drunk the waters of forgetfulness, and wakes up, shocking his entire family on his funeral pyre as they're about to set it alight. And that's a very, very old tale, but it has a lot of the core elements, this traveling to the darkness and then having to make a choice and all that kind of thing. There's a wonderful, just as an aside, there is a wonderful fiction book out now by Connie Willis, who's a science fiction writer, and it's called Passages. And it's a book about two near-death researchers, a young man and a young woman, and their experience in trying to investigate and look for possible causes of the experience. And it's not only a wonderful sort of mystery novel and, you know, wonderful read, but it also has a lot of the science incorporated in it. So you get kind of almost like a first-hand contact with how some of the experimentation is done in a very enjoyable way. So the core experiences have been identified by a number of researchers. What Bruce Grayson has done is kind of separate them out into types of features. He talks about cognitive features that people typically talk about: a time distortion, either things slowing down or speeding up. Thought acceleration, they're thinking about a lot of things, everything is happening very quickly. A life review, some kind of revelation at the end. Sometimes near-death experiencers will say, I was given a view of the future of the world, and they showed me everything that was going to happen, and I saw it all, and I can't remember what I saw. That kind of thing. The first near-death experiencer I ever saw in 1980, Kenneth Ring, had just published his first book and was giving a talk at an Academy of Religion and Psychical Research meeting in Chicago, and he brought along 4 experiencers, and one of them was a young man named Rick Bradshaw, who had been a bag boy at a grocery store and was leaning over somebody's trunks putting the bags in when somebody on the other side backed up, and he was caught in between. And his near-death experience was he was very nice young man, well recovered, sitting there telling us this story, and the room was full of, you know, college students, professors, reporters, skeptics, believers, neutral people, and by the time he finished, the entire audience was in tears. And it had been a profound experience. It's bothering me now. It had been a profound experience for him. And he was one of the ones that had that thing of moving through a corridor rather than a tunnel, coming and talking to people about his life, seeing this panorama and didn't remember it anymore. And then when he came back, said that he had changed his entire life. He just wasn't interested in the things that he'd been interested in before, and we'll talk about that in a minute, because there's a lot of transformative effects that come from these experiences. So then there's these affective features, these emotional features of near-death experiences, like a sense of peace, joy, cosmic unity, and encounter with a light. Now these are the positive NDE experiences, because there are also negative ones. The paranormal features of OBEs are vivid sensory events, being able to see everything that's happening around you. And before we get out of this section, I'm going to tell you about one that is really astonishing, that comes from a paper by Dr. Michael Sabom that was published in 1998. If you have extra cash, it's expensive, but this is a terrific book. It's published by, it's here in the library. It's published by the American Psychological Association. Carl's has a chapter in here on OBEs, and Bruce Grayson on NDEs. And it's an excellent look at a whole variety of different kinds of anomalous experiences. It's very scholarly, but very well written and easy to read. And the Sabom, a description of the Sabom article that I'm going to tell you about in a little minute is in here. So he talks about these paranormal features, and then aspects of an NDE that really feel like an out-of-body experience, where you see your body and you're having all this. And blind people being able to see, having near-death experiences. There's one in a collection, and I can't recall which collection it was. It might have been yours. The guy that rolls down the hill is a blind man who had sight at one point, lost his sight in World War II, is hill climbing in Scotland with his partner. And in Scotland, on the weekends, that's what you do. You climb hills. So he was climbing a hill, and he tripped and fell and began to roll down that hill, and was rolling down the hill in such a way that he very well could have fallen off a cliff and died. He pops out of his body and sees perfectly everything that's happening. Once he wakes up in his body again, he's blind. And there are experiences in an article, in a book by Kenneth Ring, I think, called Mindsight, where some of the NDE experiencers are blind from birth, but in their NDE they see perfectly. And they describe what they see and they understand what they see. That's pretty interesting. Grayson also talks about transcendental features, and those are when people have encounters with mystical beings or visible spirits. And then there's a phenomenological detail that pops up a lot, and that there's this barrier, and you have to make your choice before you get to that barrier. You can't cross that barrier unless you make your choice about leaving life or coming back. Now, there are negative NDEs, and a lot of people, they weren't suppressed actually, but people didn't really like to talk about them. They tend to be experienced by people who have their near-death experience because of suicide. They are experiences where people will wake up and instead of feeling joy and bliss and all this other stuff, they see fire and brimstone. They're in a terrible cold place. They have people bugging them. They have people telling them their life is an illusion and nothing is real. And they come back with a feeling of dread and horror about the experience. And then as they get more aware of the near-death experience literature and other people who are having these experiences, then there's this extra load of weight that settles on them. What did I do to deserve this one? Why did I have this and not one of these joyful ones? In some of the ones that Grayson has looked at, there are experiences where they start out terrifying and then the person gives themselves over to the experience and it becomes peaceful and joyful. So for some of them it may be a sense of resistance. But in others there's a transformative aspect that happens in their lives afterwards because they feel that they've had a very negative experience for a reason. So those are difficult. And one of the things that Grayson talks about a lot is how clinicians and doctors and nurses should be handling people who have these experiences. Because these are people who are coming out of the experiences not excited to tell you about how they saw Aunt Rosie, but absolutely burdened by having had a brush with an afterlife none of us want to think about. So that's something that he also talks about. Can we see the next slide, please? Now this one and the next slide after are just two slides that are from two different studies. This one was done comparing a Chinese and a UK sample, and they're looking at the phenomenology and the experiences. This is the kind of study that parapsychologists or psychologists would do in the sense that we're just looking at the kinds of things people report. And there is a lot of similarity in the core features, this feeling of euphoria, the life review, thought acceleration, time acceleration, the out-of-body experience where you see your body. And then there becomes a little bit of a difference in terms of the kinds of things that are very usual in the UK sample and not very usual at all in the Chinese sample. Fewer of them, for instance, are having meaningful sounds or the feeling of joy. The next one I find very interesting. This is a study that was done by Stevenson, Dr. Stevenson, and an Indian colleague of his, Satwan Pasricha, who has also worked with him in reincarnation. This shows, again, the core phenomena is pretty much the same, saw beings of light and so on. But this is the Indian stuff. And this is very interesting. Met a man with a book. Sent back, it was an administrative error. Somebody else was supposed to go instead of me. And I think in this article that somebody makes a sort of semi-facetious suggestion that, well, India is a very bureaucratic country. Maybe that's why the core phenomena got embellished in that particular way. So anyway, now the psychological theories of how the NDE forms talk about things like expectation of death. So what you're doing is you're making this wonderful imaginal dream, if you have a positive one, that's going to help you. It's a defense mechanism facing your impending doom. And one of the things that gives weight to the psychological theories is that people don't have to be actually medically near death or have medically died in order to have these experiences. People who believe that they're going to die or believe that they're dying also have these experiences, and that the experiences are basically put together from your culture, from your knowledge, from your religion, and so on. When the cross-cultural studies are done, however, this core set of phenomena always stays the same or stays very, very similar, and that argues against this notion that what you're just doing is making a culturally specific dream. And then sometimes people have experiences that are absolutely in opposition to their religious training or their religious belief. People who come from a Western religious tradition who have absolutely no belief in reincarnation, and maybe that's considered to be something even sinful that you wouldn't, you're not supposed to think that way, and they're meeting people who are waiting to come back to reincarnate, or they're being given the choice themselves. Do you want to go back to this life, or do you want to come with us and then reincarnate as somebody else? So they're getting information, or they're meeting religious figures that are giving them information that are not in accordance with the culture that they've grown up in, or with the traditions that they believe before they have the experience. And that argues against the idea that it's only a psychological experience. And this notion that children, there's been a lot of work done with children. Melvin Morse has done it, and frequently they'll draw their experiences. And there again, you're seeing the core features. And presumably a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old is way too young to have gotten a sense of what an NDE is supposed to look like, or what the afterlife is supposed to look like, in order to manufacture this dream. Susan Blackmore and a number of other studies have talked about the notion that maybe all you're doing in an NDE is reliving the birth experience. You go get forced down a tunnel, there's a light at the end, this kind of thing. Some researchers have said, well, this is silly because children don't have the visual acuity or the cortical capacity to actually get all that information and then keep all that information. But then Susan Blackmore tested it in a very interesting way. She did a survey of people who had had natural vaginal births and people who had been born through cesarean section, and did a survey, and the NDE rate, or the OBE rate in the two groups was identical. So there wasn't a tendency for the people who had experienced a natural birth to have more of this kind of imagery. I think what we're going to do is take a break for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to talk about the medical side of it, because there are a number of theories about what medically could be causing people to have these experiences. After that, we're going to talk a little bit more about the survival notion and this idea of the afterlife and what it does to people's feelings about their belief systems and their lives and what the purpose of their lives are.
To publish a paper.
You'll find people that are working on out-of-body problems, like Peter Brugger, for instance, who's a scholar in Europe, and he finds other ways to talk about it so that he can put his articles in other journals. And Carlos and I have sanitized our titles on occasion to try and get into the mainstream literature, because there's this huge animosity or fear or whatever it is, there's just this huge barrier to anybody with anything to do with parapsychology getting out into the mainstream. And it impacts on our funding, it impacts on our ability to get jobs, it impacts very seriously on our ability to recruit people to do research, because you can lose a job because of an interest. As an academic, as a medical person, you can have your career completely turned around because of an avowed interest. And if you really have a serious interest, and that's what you're doing most of your work on, there comes a point in your life, like it happened to Carlos and I, that if you excise all the parapsychology from your curriculum vitae, from your resume, you've got your name and your date of birth at the top, and that's like it, because that's where we've done most of our research. So then you lose your ability actually to make that transition, because you don't have what the conventional people have. So it's a vicious circle.
At the same time, even through you pay for it sometimes, what we try to do is put the papers out there as much as we can. Send it to the psychology journals. If they say no, they said no. To the psychiatry journals. I have got several. I just got something published in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. Very good, prestigious psychiatry journal. Every time that happens, the door opens a little more. Because I get my paper, next month, the other guy that comes with a paper, it will be easy for him, because he can say, hey, you're publishing that, so here is mine. And slowly,
and
that's what we're doing.
That's what we've been done, and Dr. Grayson has done that his whole career, really and the door has opened, And then I think also this shift of rhetoric too, where people are beginning to talk to the healthcare professionals about, don't even think about whether or not this is a real experience. Think about the consequences of not letting this person talk. Think about the consequences of not behaving in a caring fashion. Think about the consequences of the fact that even though he looks unconscious, he may not be unconscious. So turn the radio off during the surgery and don't make nasty comments, and this kind of thing. So they're kind of trying to focus on, first there's a message here about unconscious is not unconscious, and then there's a message about how do you best treat the person. We had a grief counselor in here the other day who was saying that what she tells people in grief counseling and in bereavement counseling is it does not matter if the person who's sitting in front of you saw an apparition of their dead husband or not. If that apparition helped them bring closure to their experience and helped comfort them and move them forward in the grieving process so that they're getting close to well adjustment again, what do you care about whether it's real or not? On the other hand, you need to know something about that experience, so you need to read in our literature, you need to be a little more well informed, but at the point of contact with a person's experience, there has to be respect, there has to be caring, there has to be, that person's well-being has to be the primary thing. So I think that's helped open the door. But in general, our field has had severe difficulties. We're hoping with as the door opens for alternate healing and all kinds of different kinds of medical methodologies, that will also open the door for us as well. Because I think people are the mainstream seems to be becoming more comfortable with the idea of spirituality. You see medical sociology studies in traditional medical journals that are talking about the healing rates of people who are churchgoers versus non-churchgoers, and guess what? The people who pray and are being prayed for are getting well quicker and are doing better in their readjustment and their rehabilitation and so on. So there's like a door opening there too, and we're hoping that will help us indirectly. Because to be perfectly honest, we're interested in it because I think, well, I am, and I think an awful lot of people in parapsychology are interested in the out-of-body experience and the near-death experience because of what it says about survival, about the possibility of there really being an afterlife, about the possibility of there really being a soul. And in many places in psychology and conventional science, that word, the soul, is...
That's the type of paper that if you send to a psychology journal, most likely will be rejected.
Yeah.
It's okay maybe to say 20% had an out-of-body experience. They can deal with it. But if you say this is a spiritual experience, or this may show how you survive bodily death, or something along those lines, then it's really very hard. So, there are different levels, different degrees, different things that conventional science can tolerate.
Yeah.
But still, you keep going, and slowly things change.
Things get a
These
little
things
better.
never change from one day to another.
No.
It's a process of 1 or 2 generations of new researchers that are coming, and people that are growing, being accustomed to this. The physicians have never heard, or counselors have never heard about death as a topic of psychological discussion. A lot of them never heard about that, had a lot of problems. a lot of the new people that have been trained in the last 20 years, they have grown up hearing about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, about the studies that we have, heard here. So for them, the word death as a study, as a topic of study, is okay. But a little before that, death, will give the heebie-jeebies to anyone.
So you
they will almost tremble. They will almost have a reaction like that. And that still happens, but it's getting better.
It's getting better.
And that opens the door.
Does anybody need to get some water or anything? Because if not, I think we'll just get back. Okay, then the next transparency. Of course, one of the consequences of having the medical profession get very interested in this, they're searching for the reason, the cause of near-death experiences, and a lot of things have been proposed, and I'm going to talk about a few things. One is that this notion of anoxia, of having a lack of oxygen to the brain, and one of the researchers that brought this up. It came from his observations of fighter pilots who would, at high levels of acceleration, lose consciousness. And some of the phenomenology they would report, like being pulled out of their bodies, sounded like an out-of-body experience or a near-death experience. So he made the theoretical suggestion that maybe as the brain loses oxygen in the surgery or because of some kind of trauma, then the near-death experience is a reaction to this lack of oxygenation. People who look at the phenomenology, though, of the near-death experiences, they're very detailed, they're very specific, they have a lot of cohesion and consistency. It's not like a dream in which at one moment you're in one dream landscape and then you go through the door and you're somewhere else and something totally different is happening. It has a kind of chronological consistency to it that you don't see even in dreaming, and you certainly don't see in the kinds of symptoms that pilots will talk about when they have this cerebral anoxia, or other people that have lose oxygen to the brain but don't report an NDE. They report little pieces of experience here and there. So that's a point that people like Bruce Grayson will make is, okay, maybe that has something to do with it, but you don't see in those people the kind of consistent, progressive experience with these core phenomena. Another thing that people have talked about is the impact of anesthetic on patients, particularly one called ketamine. It's known that ketamine hallucinations have some features that are similar to the out-of-body experience and the near-death experience. Traveling through a tunnel, time acceleration, feeling like you're out of your body, seeing your body from a distance, this kind of thing. And so again, there was the suggestion that all of these experiences are just a consequence of anesthetic. They don't have any meaning other than that. The people are drugged out and that's what's happening. But if you take a look at them phenomenologically and look at the drug-induced experiences and the near-death experience, again, you've got two totally different kinds of things. Yes, there may be time acceleration. Yes, there may be a tunnel and mist, but there's not this cohesive experience with these core phenomena. There's not these after effects. There's not this meaningfulness that the person takes away with this need to tell everybody who'll stand still that they had this experience. So phenomenologically, two types of experiences are very, very different. So again, the near-death community has not been convinced by that. Now, recently, one of the things that you look for then is you want to have somebody come back with, it's like the exteriorization experiments, you want to have somebody come back with identifiable information that you can show there was no way for them to know during their NDE. And that kind of gives a validity to the NDE experience. One of the experiences that people talk about, a gentleman was being worked on, had been in cardiac arrest, and was describing the crash cart and all this kind of thing. And most of what he was describing, he could have felt or heard or inferred from what he saw on television. But the one thing that he kept focusing on was, I saw these two needles, and one of them stood there, and the other one moved up slowly. And then something would happen. And then I saw this needle, and this one moved up slowly. It was the indicator on the front of the defibrillator pads. So one was the level at which the pad had to recharge before they could use it to defibrillate his heart, and the other one was the one that charted that recharging. And it was something that you could only see if you were right in front of this machine, and it's not a detail that shows up on television. It's not something he could have inferred from what was being said around him. So for a while people were saying, this is the kind of detail that we're looking for in an NDE experiment like Maria's shoe, something that we can point to and say, boy, this looks like this person was in the position that they said they were in. When I was first teaching in Chicago years and years ago, one of my students brought in a tape from a Chicago cop who'd had an NDE. And the guy was not willing to come and talk to the class personally, but he made this wonderful tape about his experience, and he had had a cardiac arrest. And his experience was, and it was one of these wonderful, voices like that, really straightforward and to the point. And we played it out over speakers. I had a big auditorium. He had the cardiac arrest. He found himself sitting on a supply cabinet on the other side of the room, on the top of the supply cabinet, watching the people work on his body. And at one point, there was a little nurse in the back who couldn't have been one of the cardiac team because people were ignoring her, he said. And the doctors were saying, all right, that's it, time of death. And she's going, no, try it again, no, try it again. So in this taped report we had, he was saying, and I'm sitting up there on that cabinet saying, listen to her, for God's sake, listen to her, this kind of thing. So later on, he was able to describe this nurse. He recognized this nurse, so for him, that was a real experience. He was able to prove to himself that he had seen that person, and he was able to thank her for being the one that got them to do it one more time, which brought him back. In 1998, Michael Sabom published a description. There's a medical procedure. I'm trying to see where he published it. There's a medical procedure that they do when they have to do brain surgery, and this was a surgery that was done on, I guess it was in his most recent book, Light and Death, One Doctor's Fascinating Account of Near-Death Experiences. This is a surgery that they do, it's a preparation that they do when they have to get into the brain, and the brain has to be devoid of all activity, all blood, and the body has to be cooled. So the patient had an aneurysm on her brain, and it would be inoperable unless they could somehow deflate that aneurysm. So what they did was they had a team of 20 people. They literally cooled her. They were recycling her body, her blood in her body, cooling the blood and putting it back in until her body temperature went down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, at which point her heart stopped. And they had a click. They wanted to know when her brain stopped responding so that they would know that the body was completely quiescent and they would have a certain amount of time to do this procedure, get her warmed up, and get out of there. And so they had microphones in her ears, and they had a little mechanism that was making a click, click, click that would show up on the EEG, and they could tell that she was responding to it. So that was something that was going on all the time. They were monitoring her blood flow. They were monitoring her body temperature. They were monitoring everything they could monitor because this was a very tricky situation, and they could easily lose her. So they cool her down to that part. They drain the blood from her brain, and this clicking noise is still going, and finally the brain's not reacting to the clicking noise. During this procedure, now the brain is all quiet. This aneurysm has deflated. They can take care of it, cut it off, do whatever they need to do, and they start warming her back up. And the procedure took, I think she was out for like 45 minutes or something, during which time they had continuous readings on virtually every aspect of her physiology. When she woke up, many days later in recovery, she described what happened, what people were talking about, what were they listening to in terms of the music. She knew who were the nurses and doctors who had taken care of her. She had an enormous amount of detail about that period in which she absolutely was not there. There was no possibility that she had heard anything because her ears were plugged up with these little earplugs that went to the machine that they were using to monitor her brain activity. She was kept completely still in the bed that she was in. So the level of information that she came back with from her NDE was so significant, and during a period when they absolutely knew for sure she was brain dead. There was no body in that brain, there was no blood in that brain, there was no electrical activity in that brain, and she brought back this detail. So needless to say, the near-death community that looks at some other explanation for the near-death experience other than drugs and physiology and all these things are very excited about this particular report, because if this report is absolutely verifiable, and Sabom is a physician who's done a lot of publishing over the years, then this is a person who had an NDE during a period when the body absolutely was not functioning. So how did she get this information, and how could she reconstruct or imagine the information in the kind of detail that she did? The best explanation for her tale is that she was in the room watching the procedure as the procedure took place, just not in the body, in the room. So those are the kinds of things that people are looking for. When we talk about the survival theory, which is the thing that we're interested in, is does this say anything about survival after death? One of the things that we tend to look at is this aspect of the transformative effects of these experiences, the after effects. And Carlos has looked at that in his OBEers, and a lot of people have looked at it in terms of the NDE work. He talked a little bit this morning about a reanalysis that we did of data that was collected by an Australian researcher, in which he had collected a number of NDEs, and we were looking to see whether people elaborated on those tales over time. One of the things that she talked about in her book, and her name is Sherry Sutherland, and the book was called
Reborn in the Light.
Reborn in the Light. So many lights we've got out there. Light in the life. After a while, at one point we were all getting a little woozy from all these lights, and we were saying somebody should publish something called Tired of the Light, you know, because everything was in the light. This book is a very interesting book. She did something that's called, she did an ethnographic study of these people. She did very heavy-duty interviews with all of them. And she used an academic approach that's called grounded theory, where you go and you interview them, and then you come up with ideas, and you go back and interview them again, and then you've talked to 5 more people, and you have more ideas, and you go back to the first one. So you end up getting these very, 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 what they call thick descriptions of the person's experience and the effect that it had on their lives. And one of the things that she talks about, and Bruce Grayson mentions this, and a lot of the writers who write on near-death experience mention, is that people come back from these near-death experiences, they need to talk about it, they tell people. The majority of people that they talk to don't want to hear about it, don't understand it, don't have a framework to fit it into, and there are very, very, very high divorce rates among married people where one partner has had this experience and the other partner just does not know who this person is anymore. There are cases in Sherry Sutherland's data collection and in other ones where someone who has been a stockbroker or a banker or very interested in material things comes back and wants to give it all away and now give their life over to charity and to love and to whatever. One of the people in her case collection in Australia, her husband got very excited about the idea, and they literally overturned their life completely and sold everything, went off and changed their lives so that they were giving to people for the rest of their lives. So he adopted her values, but in many, many cases that doesn't happen. The X-ray technician that you saw in the film that we showed, who was talking about his experience, the one with the white hair, a little later on in that same tape he says, well, I've been married to my wife for 36 years and I love her and she just doesn't want to hear about it, so I don't talk about it. So here's this profound experience that has changed him, and in order to keep his marriage he has to not say anything. So groups like the International Association for Near-Death Studies, which has chapters all over the country, are really important for experiencers because they can go there and talk about their experience to other people who've had the experiences, and they can talk about the impact that it has on the family. One of the videotapes that I don't think it was one that we previewed for this, it might have been one that we'd seen in another context, had a woman saying, oh yeah, he says he's changed. He hasn't changed, he's still angry, he still wants his dinner at 7 o'clock, what is this change stuff? And then when you look at him, he's saying, oh, I love everybody and I'm so patient and I just want to do charity work and I'm going to give away all my cars. And, so it may not also be the perception they have of who they are now may not also fit how other people see them. But certainly you come back into a family environment that expects you to be dad back again from the grave, and instead you're some other guy entirely, or some other person entirely. And what's interesting in some of the research that we've done and other people have done is that sometimes the experience that makes this profound transformation, when you read it, it doesn't knock your socks off. It's a very basic, I went through the tunnel, I saw Jesus, he said, you want to go back? I said, okay, I came back, I know there's no death, and now everything's different. And then other people who have had these very elaborate and deep experiences with a lot of detail will change a little bit, but not a lot. And then there are others like the fellow who fell off the mountain in the tape that I showed, who actually don't remember the whole experience for many years, or something someone says 5 or 6 years later brings the whole thing back, and then the transformation begins. So that's another area that parapsychology and psychology are interested in. Parapsychology for the reason that this may have some meaning in our discussions about is there survival, is there an afterlife, what kind of evidence can we gather for that? And psychologists and parapsychologists are interested in it because these experiences change people's lives. So whatever is the reality about the experience, however it happens, wherever it comes from, the fact that it changes people's lives makes it very important to study, something that we really need to research. So I think I have hit all my marks. And that's the end of all I have to say today. If you have any questions. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the name of the book by Sherry Sutherland.
It was called Reborn in the Light of Grayson. Well, let me see though. Yeah, that is it's a very interesting book because I think it's unique, isn't it? And in terms of the amount of contact she had with the experiencers, she really talked to everybody, and you get a sense of their lives. One of her experiencers had a cardiac arrest and had changed her life, started doing all this charity work, and the doctor kept saying, you've got to stop, you've got to stop. And she was like, what for? This is why I'm back here, you know, and so if I die, I die. I just go over there and everything will be fine. And there's this unshakable belief in these experiencers of the afterlife, even the ones who had experiences as children, which is already amazing, you know. But that book is wonderful.
One more quick. What was the name of the near-death experience group that you mentioned?
International Association for Near-Death Studies. So it's called IANDS. They're based out of Seattle. I'm sure they have a website. They might be in your guide to sources, the little pamphlet we gave you. They have a number of chapters around the country, and I think their newsletter is like $10 a year, and what they publish are information about their events and cases, and the cases are very interesting. And there's no decline in the number of cases they get every year. They have more people coming. And they have, I think there's a group around here because one of the films that we previewed for the course was done by filmmakers at Brooklyn College, and it was a local IANS group that was meeting of people who work with near-death experiencers and people that had the experiences. So I think there's a local group around here as well.
I think wasn't it in Connecticut or something?
Well, that's where Kenneth Ring was at Storrs, University of Connecticut Storrs for a long time, and I think he's still there.
Yeah.
So Kenneth Ring, R-I-N-G. And he's written a number of books. He's the one who wrote Mindsight about the NDE experiences of the blind.
Oh, really?
And then Grayson was also in Connecticut for a while. But I think the main office is in Seattle. They have a lot of films
they have a lot
and
of chapters.
yeah, they have a lot of films and books and stuff. They're very interesting. And I think they were the ones in their conferences that the negative stuff first started to really be taken seriously, because initially people just did not want to talk about that. They didn't, and some of them are pretty terrifying. Mostly to suicides. Mostly they're suicides who will never ever think of doing that again. You know? And even the suicides who have positive experiences, Grayson has said, they're not interested in it either. You would think they saw this wonderful land and they had been prone to suicide before. No, they come back with this notion that I'm here for a reason. I have a job to do. That's waiting for me. You know, so it's really transformative. Yeah.
Building on that, I think one of the major tenets of most religions, at least today, is the idea of an afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any effort to liaise with, I hate that word, to communicate, hardly a better one, with religious groups to sort of get them interested in
That's for you, Carly.
I don't know of any, formal. The thing is, there are different types of religious groups react in different ways. If you approach more the
I'm not
fundamentalists,
suggesting that they
that's the
all
devil.
would be responsive, but there
Yeah.
must be
But there
some.
must be some, yeah.
Yeah, and I know that there are groups like the Spiritual Frontier
Yes,
Fellowship
right.
is a group here
Yeah.
in the United States that brings people that are generally Christian from different
The
denominations.
Academy of Religion and Psychical Research is their academic arm, and they're very interested. And I know that at their conventions, I've met, individuals, ministers of every faith you can think of, priests, rabbis. That's a very interdenominational group. But it's like a lot of other parapsychological groups, it's a very small group. They do research and they have an interest. So in terms of a formal kind of thing.
I don't know anything formal,
Yeah.
that's been done.
That might be an interesting avenue to explore.
Yeah, the problem is sometimes you get opposition from corners that you don't expect it, like this young woman with the Monsignor saying, oh, well, she had brain damage.
Yes, but the woman wasn't objecting.
No, it didn't bother her at all. Yeah, that's right.
Sometimes, I remember reading in the literature, some of the conflicts have come from some parts of religion that have trouble with the idea that you can develop your own concepts of religion, God, or what you have to do with your life without going through the priest, through the church, through established religion. Because what they say is what these guys are doing is relying on personal revelation. And they say, we don't believe in personal revelation. We believe in revelation through the church, through the Bible, because they have control over that big business.
Right.
And personal revelation breaks that control, because then anyone can be spiritual on their own.
And some OBEers,
and there are a lot of clashes.
some OBEers are very articulate about it, like Phyllis Atwater and Betty
yes.
Eady. They'll talk about, in their NDE experience, they said to the spiritual guide, well, why are there all these religions? Which one is the right one? And I can't remember whether it was Atwater or Eady, this guide said to her, they're all right, so it doesn't matter what you do. You can be in, be out, it doesn't matter. That's not the kind of, message. To me, it's analogous to Marian apparitions, because we've looked at Marian apparitions on occasion and
These are apparitions
of the Virgin Mary. There are those that are accepted by the church and those that aren't accepted by the church. And one of the interesting criteria for acceptance is whether or not the apparition contradicts church dogma. Because if the apparition has the bad luck to say something that the Catholic Church at the moment doesn't believe in, then it can't be the Virgin Mary. So the first thought is not, gee, maybe we're wrong and this is the Mother of God and we ought to pay attention. It's, can't be her because she'd know we were right. So I think there's a little bit of that going on as well.
It's a political game.
Yes,
especially,
I'd like to throw into the mix the shamanic tradition is something to look into, the use of shamans and this method. Perhaps is in whatever society is perhaps not as regulated as what we're coming from a formalized religion.
That's true. I think in societies where there are different types of religious views, then it's a different thing. And the shamanistic tradition, of course, is one in which but it depends too, because I don't know that area so well, but I'm sure that there are some traditions where anybody can be developed into being, it's like the Spiritist religion, where anybody can be a medium and a medium can bring revelation. But in others, it's like the Western system, where you're trained to be a high priest and you're the guy or you're the woman or whatever. You had a question?
No, it seems to me that when it comes to the medical side, or even the world as a whole, it's an evolutional process, as we do with everything in life, that I think where the conscience meets the subconscious and the unconscious,
Yeah.
all those realms get put together, and a lot of it has to do with politics, I believe.
Yeah,
amongst
I
the
think so.
different,
Yeah.
the hierarchy of needs, the same with organized religion.
Yeah.
It's a control business.
Mhm.
You just mentioned, if we each go into our own little temple,
We don't need-
have no need of them, and
That's right.
we're not going to contribute, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
It has its extremes. Everything
Yeah.
has its extremes.
Well, and I think you can take that argument to the professions too, because there's always, we find in parapsychology that a lot of what we do is very interdisciplinary, and so you run into the same kind of professional barriers you would run in just doing straight psychology or something. No, that's our stuff. You can't investigate that.
Right.
So you have those kinds of problems as well, and that's politics gets involved there. But I think the good thing about being tired of the light is that there is so much out there. There are so many people who are having experiences and talking about them, and so many new studies in the medical realm and surveys and so on, that sooner or later, you know, it's that 100th monkey thing. Sooner or later, there's going to be enough of a critical mass that I think that hopefully the tide will change.
I agree. I think, I know I had a personal experience years ago from when I had surgery, the same thing. And I had already grown up, as I said to you earlier. My father's a psychiatrist. I grew up with both sides, from the organized religion type viewpoint to the, you know, the more open-minded viewpoint and so forth. But what I found interesting is that I didn't have an opinion either way. It didn't even occur to me. It was something that I personally experienced, and I came up with such enormous detail of what happened that when I talked to my doctors and told them everything that went on, everything that I saw without knowing what procedures were going to take place, they said, well, it was subjective to the fact that I was unconscious and that the subconscious can pick up
The usual, yeah.
And they were saying all this stuff, and I still said, really? And then when I started going into conversations and to the detailed things that they were doing, and the fact that I was watching myself from above, and I felt a lot of the same things. I didn't go and meet with anybody, but I felt myself floating, and I could see everything in detail, and I could point out who was in the room that I had not met before. And so forth. Years later, I had another type of surgery. And in that one, that was at Hopkins for a reconstructive foot, and it was like I was under the anesthesia, but yet I was totally aware. And actually, I even started moving my hand at one point, because I remember that they had after I went under, they put my hands out and they taped them to this board, which I didn't know they were going to do. But apparently, at some point or other, as the doctor was doing a bone graft from my hip to my foot, they all started laughing, and it's because my hand was moving, and I was feeling parts of it I had no business feeling. And when I heard them talking about that, my hand sort of went like that, and he yelled at the anesthesiologist that I had enough.
Yeah, you weren't under enough.
Yes,
because you were aware of
I remembered
his reaction.
Everything. So when I came out of it, I told him, I said, I'm sorry. And he goes, for what? I said, for, you know. And
poking you where I
his face
shouldn't.
turned beet red, and he goes, yes, you did, but
how did you know?
How did you know?
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
But in that case, I didn't see myself floating. There was just like my subconscious was aware of what was going on. So there was a real difference between the two.
How did the first group react to you?
The first group, the doctor, I'll never forget, David McCall, urologist, they did a lithotripsy, I can't say it,
Lithotripsy?
Yeah, something like that, with a tube for a kidney stone.
Ooh,
Yes.
It was supposed to be a very quick procedure, ended up being 7 hours, and they had a difficult time waking me up. And that's where I think that I had all this. And I remember telling him all about this. You had trouble, didn't you? And he turned beet red, and he goes, very interesting. He responded, he didn't say one way or the other, but he responded, he was interested.
Yeah.
And later on, it was interesting, because each day he kept coming in, he wanted to talk a little bit more about it. Whereas when I told the nurse, she said, oh, my dear, don't you know that that's what everybody goes through? It's the drugs.
Yeah.
You know, so
how many near-death experiences are getting lost
exactly.
Yeah.
But I never discussed it with anybody. I just assume I know what I know, and no one's going to change my mind, and there's no point discussing it with anybing, because I'm not going to persuade them. Because they have their own experience.
Well, a lot of the people that wrote Carlos after his thing in the newspapers in Scotland were saying that I've never this happened to me 22 years ago. I never mentioned it to anybody. They wouldn't believe me. I know what happened.
A lot of people don't discuss it even with really close family members, with husbands and wives, and they come and they tell me, you know, a stranger, the first time. I mean, some of them do it when they check you out. You know,
he had a couple of people
at least one or two that came to the university,
looked at him
just
first,
peek around and talk to me for 5-10 minutes. And when they felt that I was not going to laugh or send them to the clinic or something like that, then they say, well, this is what happened to me. And then they open, and some of them spend an hour or more just talking. But at first, it's really careful, because they go through life, you know, knowing how people react. And no one wants to be labeled
even
as
the people that have had more than one like you, they're all different. Like Atwater's had 3 or 4 or 5. And I think Betty Eadie's had several, and each experience is different. You know, they're not all exactly the same kind of thing. And he had cases that had the whole full blown, and cases where a lot of childbirth stuff, where people were just sitting on the windowsill watching what was happening, and then whoop, okay, time to go back. You know, so everybody has kind of a different. But you were there. So now these guys have got to be careful when they talk in the surgical room, and I think that's finally getting out to these fellas and women and everybody that works that unconscious is not unconscious. Right. You can't assume that that person is not there.
Didn't they do a study that had to do with patients where the surgical crew was being negative about the remarks? The patients did not do as well as when they were positive about the comments they were saying.
Yeah, you have to be encouraging because people are listening.
Yes, you know, it's a given. I have one more question for you. How I saw that Dr. Inga Swan was in one of those. Is he not the one that's given credit for remote viewing?
Yes,
how does that correlate with out of body?
He's well, like Carlos was saying this morning, that a lot of people who have out of body experiences have a whole panoply of other psychic experiences, and like Alex Tanis, Ingo Swan has a lot of psychic ability. From working with, he worked in the dream telepathy studies. He worked in the OBE studies. He was in remote viewing in the Stargate project for years and years, and was one of the main trainers. You know, so there's a whole bunch of people out there that just have a lot of ability in a lot of different areas and a lot of different experiences, and he's one of the ones who's adept. And what's also interesting to us is that in the last 10 years or so, experimental literature has shown that people who are artists tend to be very high in psychic experiences, and Ingo Swan is an artist. So it's kind of interesting to see some of these people who have become kind of gifted psychics that get involved in lots of different experimental things and psychic development things, who also have these characteristics that we're just really uncovering in the experimental population. So that's kind of neat. But yeah, he's been around for a long time and has done a lot of stuff.
Another thing that is important to
There's
see
a
is
couple
that
books here by
out-of-body experience is not the same as remote viewing.
No.
You know, remote viewing is to obtain information of things at a distance. And what happens is that sometimes the OBE acts as remote viewing, but sometimes you can get information without being out of the body. So say the typical remote viewer will sit in a place
like
and will have images and will write and do drawings of something that they're perceiving at a distance. That doesn't necessarily has the OBE element. That is, many of them do not go out of their bodies and do not go to the place.
But there are remote viewers
some of them
who are OBEers.
So sometimes it
depends on the person.
It gets, but it can, the phenomena can work in different ways, you know, with the OBE or without.
And I think for even an individual, not always the same way, you know, from one thing to the next, that they can use different kinds, because I don't know how he does it exactly.
But I think by definition, the OBE has to involve the feeling of being out of the body. If not, you're not having an out-of-body experience. But sometimes it's hard, you know, because things kind of get mixed. And then you get performances of people like both Ingo Swan and Alex Tanis that we saw there. They are the type of people that they're able to project something, so they feel that they're there, but at the same time they're talking through their physical bodies. You know, they are able to maintain that connection. And that's very interesting. Because it shows, you know, that they are not all completely out there, but there is kind of a link. And that's what allows them to work in the lab. Because with that, they will not be able to be talking. They will have to wait then for the information.
When they come back,
when they come back.
And that's not very common either. The idea that you're awake and commenting on what your out-of-body
Except with
body
very
is doing.
gifted people like that. They seem to be able to do it. Maybe similar in some way to these cases that we were talking of people that are walking or lecturing or doing something while they're out of the body. It's just that these people have developed such a high degree of control that they are able to disengage, but not 100%. And then they can have that combination of having consciousness in
You have to tell the tale about the California officer, because you didn't tell it today. He never gives an OBE lecture without mentioning this California policewoman.
This was going to be the first, but since he insists, I will tell. But I have an interesting case of physical activity of a policewoman. She was young, new at the job, and the first night of patrol, she goes out with her partner, and they're following a car in a suspect. You know, one of these car chases, stuff we see on TV. She was very tense, being new on the job, and didn't know what was going to happen. They corner the guy. She gets out of the car with her partner, and she's the one that grabs the guy and puts the manacles on the back. They get the guy, and at that moment where she's approaching it and starting to do her stuff, she has a switch of instant. She says it was like I closed my eyes and I opened it, and I was up there looking at the whole scene. I saw the cars, the people involved, my partner, the guy, and I saw my body. I saw myself down there, and what puzzled her was that she said I was doing what I was supposed to do. All the training that I got, how to approach the person and the physical actions, everything was done right. So she was very puzzled. Then she said she saw that they got the guy and put him in the police car. You know how they do, they get the guy, they get his head, put it like that, and slam the police door, the car. Slam the door shut, and the moment when the door hits, another switch. And it's almost like she opens her eyes, and she's again in her body, looks around, and she's seeing things from this perspective, not from out there, and realizes that she had a switch, and she really could not explain it, and she had never had that experience. It was fascinating. No one else noticed anything from her account. I mean, I never had contact with her afterwards, but she sent me a detail. So that's another example. In this case, a situation that was extremely tense for her. She was already very tense as she was driving, even more when she approached the guy. It was her first day. And this is possible a case where the out-of-body experience serves a function of dealing with the anxiety. She has so much fear, so much anxiety that maybe in a different day or a different person, she could have fainted to deal with that anxiety. Or something else could have happened. But in her case, she had an out-of-body experience. So we believe that in some cases, the out-of-body experience may serve as a defense mechanism. And I'm not saying that it's necessarily imaginary because of that. It could be that something really goes out and has other components, but it still helps the person to deal with a situation that at the moment, they really cannot handle. But that's one of the most interesting cases that I have received.
And I was surprised you didn't mention it. It's in every
Has there
lecture.
ever been a case of two people simultaneously who know each other have an out-of-body experience where they interacted with each other?
We have a report that came in Carlos's Spanish, in the Masajá, the Spanish collection from Spain and the aunt was the one who sent in the letter, and the letter was that she frequently had out-of-body experiences with her nephew, and the experience she told us about was that she left her body, went to find him, and they went together to a mountainous area behind the town that they lived in, and they found an eagle's nest in the out-of-body state, and that the next morning she woke up, went to get him, he remembered, and they went to the mountains and found the eagle nest, and that was one of the letters that Carlos received.
You find that in a few other places. Experiences like that are rare, but we're not sure if they're rare because they just don't occur too often, or if it's that people do not report them. Because even within this strange world of the OBE, there are things that are more strange and wild than others. And these type of things, a lot of people, even inside, writings on OBEs, they don't report too much. But you find it here and there. You also have accounts of people that find themselves and they have sexual encounters. That seems to be coming out more. And after a while,
that's what I've heard.
Yeah. But the problem after a while, it's very hard to disentangle, fantasy from reality, because some of them, you read them and they read just like dreams, or sometimes you find them on the internet, and frankly, I don't know who's writing that and for what purpose, so sometimes you don't know where the information is coming, but there is a lot of that kind of stuff.
I was sort of like the receptacle of two people that I knew each other but lived totally opposite states, different places, and they were just platonic friends. Simply by acquaintances. What was ironic is that he said, I had the most strangest experience where I felt I was out of body. And I found all of a sudden myself attracted to this person. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And I said, well, maybe it's a subconscious thing, that maybe you, and he goes, no, I don't think so. But he said, oddly enough, is that after this experience, and I thought maybe it was a lucid dream when you mentioned that earlier, that it felt in that category. But what's ironic is that when a few months later, my friend tells me that she had this unusual dream where he came to her, and that she said, they made love, and she couldn't figure out. But what was ironic is that I thought that's interesting, but I didn't tell either one of what each one had said to me.
Yeah.
What was ironic is that the next time I saw them, where before they were like competitive rivals, there was like this warmth and affection between the two of them that I couldn't explain, and yet they had not seen each other.
Yeah.
And it's continued that way. Nothing's come of their relationship, but you can see that there's this warmth and affection and attraction between the two of them.
That wasn't there
exist.
before.
And I thought, I wonder
That's
what
interesting.
that was.
Yeah, that's interesting.
A lot of that stuff you have to go to either to the internet or to some of the recent books that have been published by astral projectors, people that write books about their life out there. And you find things like that. Scientifically speaking, that has been completely ignored. Like most of these phenomena, there is very little. But that's another component of these things that needs to be, because if there can be communication, mind to mind, and if there is really some type of place where people go, a lot of things like that are theoretically possible, and certainly people are experiencing them.
But even inside parapsychology, we have what Mary Rose Barrington is a psychical researcher in England. She calls it the jot threshold, meaning just one of those things. There are certain phenomena when people tell you about it, you're just so uncomfortable. You say, "Oh yes, dear, that's just one of those things." Get yourself out of it.
Hi there, I'm Lizette Coley. I'm president of Parapsychology Foundation, so welcome to our YouTube channel. We have lots to look at, so please check out our videos. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.